Alright, welcome back to part 2 of this video. The first half, we just covered the basic grits and types of belts that you're going to move through as you rough out and then ultimately start to move toward finishing a knife. We're going to focus specifically on finishing in this video. So as you move towards the final destination in terms of what sort of finish that you want for your knife, there are really a lot of different possibilities in terms of the types of belts that you use, which grits you stop on or continue to. We're not going to be able to cover all of them, but I'll try and give you a flavor of some of the main choices that you're going to be making as you determine what your finishing strategy is for the knife that you're working on. So up to this point, I've been doing things that probably most knife makers would do. This sequence, I'm not going to say is the same for every single knife maker, but most would find the sequence that I just ran through to be pretty familiar to them. Once you get past that, all kinds of different things might happen. Now, I'm going to go ahead and do a 400 grit belt here. This is 400 grit aluminum oxide. I'll show you the results over here on my other camera. And then we'll talk a little bit about kind of what starts to happen after you get above 220 grit. Watching carefully, you may have noticed that there was some bumping and jiggling going on. That's what's known as belt bump. The higher the grit of the belt, the thinner the belt is. Now, as you move through the belt, you'll see right here there's a little joint. There's one joint on every single belt where it's taped together. Now, the manufacturers use a very thin sort of tape, but there's still just a little bit more thickness to it right here, and what that does is it causes the belt to kind of bump your knife each time as you move through, especially on a flat platen like this that's extremely hard, and that can start to cause problems. Even though we've got basically a nice finish, there's still some scratches here that I would want to get out if I were really serious about this, and this all looks pretty good. It's just real easy once you start hitting 320, 400 grit belts to start introducing all kinds of little problems that are hard to solve once you hit this. And so it's not unusual, and this is pretty typical for me, frankly, it's not unusual for knife makers to quit at 220 and then to move on to kind of specialty belts because of the exact problems that I'm talking about right here. So before I talk about some of the final options that you might have in terms of the high grit finishing type belts, it's really important to understand what your goals are in the knife that you're making. Now, I'm not talking about your general goals as a knife maker. I want to be a professional knife maker, or I'm trying to make Excalibur or something. I'm talking about specifically the type of finish that you want to have on your knife. So let me just kind of back up a little bit and talk about a whole wide range of goals that you might want to have as you're making a particular knife. In other words, where do I see, I start out with this bar of steel, where do I see it evolving as I work my way through the different belts on this grinder? First thing is you want good geometry. You know, you just want to shape the knife correctly, have decent shaped bevels, and have everything just kind of look clean and good. More specifically, and this is kind of the second point, you want to have crisp grind lines and crisp plunge lines. You don't want to undercut your plunges, and you don't want wobbles and so forth in your grind lines. Third goal, as you're moving through the belts, you want to erase all the previous scratches. We talked about that before, so I won't go too much into it, but you don't want to ever get way down the road and realize, oh, I got all this crap hiding under here, and now I got to start back on 120 grit or 60 grit or something, clean up all these old scratches, and redo all my work. Fourth, just save as much freaking time as you can. When people first start getting started making knives, one of the things they don't realize is they're going to have to buy a lot of belts. If you're going to make many knives, belts wear out, you just got to replace them. You got to buy a lot of belts. And let me tell you one thing, if you're trying to make a reasonable number of knives, fresh belts make all the difference. If you just think, oh, I'm just going to take this further and further and further out there where it's worn out and you can practically see through the belt, everything's going to take more time. You're going to heat things up more. So basically a lot of things can go wrong if you just try to use your belt into absolute oblivion. Go ahead and replace them and use a fresh belt. And you just have this sigh of relief when you get started on a new belt. They cut faster, they cut more accurately, easier to use. Anyway, I won't go on any further with that. But the fifth point, and this was something I was kind of alluding to earlier, you want to know where you're trying to end up. There are a lot of different kinds of surfaces that knife makers might want to use. And those surfaces are going to be kind of part of your signature as a knife maker. The most simple one is just a rough ground, where you can just see all the grind lines. Nothing wrong with that if you're making a utility knife, a chef's knife, something like that. Just having visible grind lines, nothing wrong with that. Moving up from that, bead blasted or tumbled kind of knives, you may stop at roughly the same place and then do an additional operation that's designed to kind of give it a matte finish, and I won't say hide the scratches or the grind lines, but just to kind of give it a smoother looking finish. After that, there's a hand rubbed satin finish. You'll see that on tons of Bowie knives and things like that. If you're going to have a nice hand rub finish, you really have to do all the foundation work very accurately, especially if you start to go up to too high grit belts, thinking, oh, I'm going to save myself some time by going up to really high grit belts. As we said earlier, it's easy to get on high grit belts and start creating geometrical problems, or even just little divot kind of things, ripples and dips and stuff like that don't necessarily look bad while the scratches are still on there, but then once you go to a hand rub finish, it starts to look really bad. So beyond that, mirror polishing. Now, I never mirror polish my blades. It's just not a look that I like. I'm speaking a little bit from ignorance on that subject, but I think you would tend to find that folks who do mirror polishes tend to use wheels. The reason for that is that this really rough surface exaggerates that belt bounce that we talked about. And there's some other problems that you can have with high grit belts, the really fine grit belts, that are exaggerated by a flat platen. And so using a wheel, which is softer and the edges tend to be sort of braided off, rounded off a little bit, sometimes will give you a smoother surface as you're grinding into those higher grit belts. And that in turn will allow you to have a nicer, smoother, ripple-free finish if you're going to a mirror. And then you kind of have some specialty grinds if you're prepping for Damascus etching, if you're making some kind of ethnic blade that has a particular type of finish on it, maybe Japanese style sword or something like that. All of those might lead you in different directions in terms of where you're going to leave off, what kind of belts you're going to use on the belt grinder. One final point that I would make is that there also are a number of specialty belts which are sometimes used just as a finishing belt themselves. Structured abrasives, cork belts, which are typically used for polishing. So my general point here is that all abrasives are not good for all things. Yes, the basic strategy with an abrasive is just to grind a hole into something, or grind a, take metal off and put it on the floor. But, different abrasives have different little chores that they like doing better or worse. So let me talk a little bit about some of those final types of grinds that you might want to do. So this right here is what's known as a surface conditioning belt. Sometimes people call them Scotch-Brite belts. Scotch-Brite, of course, is a trade name of 3M Corporation, but many different abrasive manufacturers sell surface grind or surface conditioning belts. Some folks like using them at the end, and I'll give you a little demo of what what kind of look you'd achieve by using these. So what you're going to end up with a surface conditioning belt is something that is it's a nice sort of smooth looking finish. So this is a fairly fine grit. There are different colors, and each of the different colors corresponds to different grit sizes. But what you'll see here is that you get a really nice, smooth, even looking finish with this. This would be more of a final finish kind of thing. This would be appropriate for working knives. Also, chef's knives and stuff like that. This looks great on. But basically, any type of knife where you want to have a ground finish, where you want to actually be able to see the scratches, but you want it to look nice and even, this is a good choice. So, when you're using regular cloth back belts, sometimes we talked about belt bump. That can cause slight shifts in the angles of the scratch lines. It can cause the knife to go a little bit back and forth like this, and those cause sort of uneven mottled look to appear in the surface of the blade. This will really help get rid of that kind of problem. So if you want a fairly fine ground finish, this is a pretty good choice. So off camera, I just put in another little grind on the top here, a false edge grind. It's very common now, it's kind of a fad, you might say, to have all kinds of complicated grinds, nightmare grinds, and all these different grinds that have maybe 3 or 4 different angles and bevels. And it takes a lot of skill to grind all those extra grinds and to keep them real even. So one thing that I kind of like to do, and this actually came out of my background in doing Japanese style blades, which normally have 2 different bevels, and those bevels are really complicated or difficult to do on a belt grinder. And so one of the things that I found, actually, as I recall, I think it was Rick Barrett told me about this probably 15 years ago or something. Structured abrasives, and there are a bunch of different little strategies that are used by belt manufacturers, but the idea with a structured abrasive is that you have some way of building up abrasives so that you can work your way down through the abrasives, and you have a very consistent abrasive profile as you move through the belt. What I mean by that is, with a typical belt, or typical aluminum oxide or ceramic or whatever, when you first use it, you've got a lot of really sharp little grains of abrasive sticking out, and as you knock the top off of all those little grains, you have not only a belt that cuts slower, but it also yields a sort of smoother looking finish. In effect, it's as though a 60 grit became a 120 grit, or a 120 grit belt after it's worn becomes a 220 grit belt. Structured abrasives are designed to kind of avoid that problem, so that from the time you first use it to the time you're done, always, 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 that belt is going to be exactly the same. There's a little funny side benefit that happens from some of the strategies that the belt manufacturers use in these structured abrasives. Basically, you don't get any belt bounce here, because right there, with all these abrasives working their way down, there's actually no bump there, and so you can go up to very high grits and maintain a nice, smooth, consistent surface. But beyond that, they also just don't cut super fast. They're not very aggressive. They're terrible for roughing. But when you're finishing, especially these really complicated little grinds, just the slightest bit of screw up in these grinds can be amplified and cause really bad things to happen. So it's not unusual for me to use these structured abrasives for the very, very final setting of the geometry. I'll kind of show you a little bit of that right here. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to go ahead and work on these little bevels right here. One thing to note is if you watch me doing these videos, I almost always am working one side of the knife, and that's just a photographic thing. If you work the other side of the knife, I'm standing here so that you can't see what I'm doing. So in this case, the bottom bevel has to be worked here, and then the top bevel has to be worked on the other side, so you won't be able to see what I'm doing very well, but I'll do my best to let you see it. So I've actually dropped down to, this is what's known as an A300 belt. It's a different nomenclature for the abrasive sizes here, but this is kind of equivalent to, I don't know, maybe 120 grit or something like that. But it doesn't really look quite like 120, but it certainly looks more rough than the 400 grit, I guess. But anyway, you can see that it gives you a really crisp line here. And the nice aspect of these is that you can go pretty slowly with them, and it allows you to really have a lot of finesse when you're doing some of these complicated grinds, just, you know, getting all the lines worked out nicely. Alright, so that about wraps it up. Just to summarize my general point here, it always helps to have a sense of what your end is. If you know what your end point is, then that's going to help you get you know, negotiate through there. A lot of times I think, you know, when people are starting out as knife makers, they just sort of blast into a knife and just hope that it'll end up in the right place. You really want to have a strategy for getting to that final point. The starting phases, roughing, and, you know, just the first couple grits that you use, kind of going to be the same for most knife makers. But if you're looking to mirror polish, if you're looking to you know, do a Bowie knife or something with a hand rub finish, each of those is going to need a slightly different finishing strategy. So once you start getting to 120, 220, even 320 or 400, you really want to have a sense of what your final goal is, because if you use the wrong belt at that point, you can sort of get into that you can't get there from here situation where you're just knocking yourself out trying to achieve some particular goal that particular belt is just absolutely not suited for. So if I had any final wisdom on this, you know, just try out a bunch of different kinds of belts, and you'll find that some belts really are very suitable for the kind of things that you're doing, and some are really terrible. When I was first getting started, I kind of went down the road of, you know, using some of the same kinds of belts too long, and I got really frustrated because I was trying to accomplish something with a belt that just wasn't suited for that particular task. All right, hope you learned something, and we'll see you soon. Thanks for watching, guys. If you feel like you got something out of this video, don't forget to subscribe. Also, click on the link to Patreon for a great way to give back to the channel. Plus, check me out on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Links in the description. If you want something sharp and pointy, maybe a gift for yourself or one of the cooler people in your life, check out my Tactics Armory website and pick up one of our tactical or outdoor knives. And finally, if you want to learn to make Hamones or Japanese swords, check out WalterSorrellsBlades.com, where you can find videos about how I make Hamones, as well as forging, mounting, polishing, and fittings for Japanese swords. Thanks, and see you soon.